To discuss strategies for sustaining our water resources, please welcome our panel. Assistant Professor, GW's School of Engineering and Applied Science, Royce Francis. Senior Sustainability Advisor, Beth Sauerhaft. And our moderator, Director of GW's Environmental Resource Policy Program, Peter Linquiti.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to GW. I just work upstairs, so welcome to my house. Our topic for this panel is water and sustainability. We've got some genuine experts here on the panel. Their bios are in your material. And what I thought I might do is seed the conversation with a couple of questions that each of you could take a run at answering, and then we can allow the audience to weigh in with questions. Volunteers wearing green t-shirts can take your questions and bring them up front to the coordinator. So when I think about water and sustainability, I guess I start first with fresh water, with clean water, and how you all as managers in organizations meet the obligation to provide the water that your organizations need to conduct their operations successfully. How do you source water at the right time in the right place? And then simultaneously, you have obligations as managers, either because of internal or external stakeholders, or because you're working under the executive order, or maybe your agency's sustainability plan, to source your water and use your water in a sustainable fashion. So that tension between meeting your organization's need for water, where and when they need it, with being wise stewards of that water once you've got it onto the facility or your organization. So I find myself wondering how practitioners make that balance between meeting operational needs and serving sustainability. What are the challenges? Maybe if you look out a decade, you were a water manager for a large organization. What are the big things that might cause you to lose sleep?
I'd like to start with me. So, well, as a water manager, one of the things that I would be looking into is how I can characterize the water impact or the water footprint of my organization. And of course, the most important thing that we would look into is how we are directly consuming water. But if I could just take the conversation in a little bit of a different direction, maybe one that one might not have considered, is looking at the indirect impacts that your operations may have on water use. Because in the grand scheme of things, you're situated in a geographic location, and you need to make sure that your impacts in that geographic location ensure the longer-term sustainability of the water resource. And so one of the areas of research that we've been looking into here at GW is the power and water nexus. And in terms of indirect impacts, there may be opportunities to synergize the attention that's being paid to greenhouse gas reductions or electricity efficiency efforts and water footprint reductions. And if you don't mind me using a cultural theme that maybe everyone is aware of, just to make my point, I live in Baltimore City. And of course, many of you know that there's a lot of tension between the police and the general public. And Black Lives Matter has come up, but then there's been this Blue Lives Matter on the other side. The point being that if we don't protect the police, no one can enjoy security. But if population views that their needs may not be addressed, then there's going to be tension that impedes the ability of the police to protect. And so here, Blue Lives Matter would be like your direct consumption. Indirect would be like Black Lives Matter. And I say all drops matter. And what I mean by that, what I mean by all drops matter is that what you have to do is look at the impact that your electricity consumption patterns have on the local water resources. And you may be able to do that in partnership, given the size of the federal government or maybe the size of operations under your management. You may be able to look at your local electricity providers and try to come up with a plan with them to minimize the impact of your electricity consumption on the local environment, given that different cooling technologies that may be used at the generation facilities have different impacts. Different technologies, some renewables, such as solar and wind, may have lower water impacts. whereas other renewables like hydro will have higher water consumption impacts because of the evaporation. And so one of the things as a water manager I would just like you to take away from this conversation is that all drops matter. In compliance with the executive order, one of the things that you can do to synergize or to compound the benefits of the electricity efficiency investments that your organization may be making is to look into how water impacts may also further increase the benefits of changes in your electricity consumption patterns.
Great, thanks. Beth?
Yeah, and to add to that, so we all know that when you're looking at a carbon footprint, your greenhouse gas emissions, what you emit in what your organization or your operations emit in one place impacts the global carbon emissions, the global rate of carbon emissions. But water, of course, is a very local issue. And, as I was thinking about this panel, and you're mostly with the U.S. government, but water, from the point of view of the U.S. government, is not just a U.S. issue. It's a global issue. And partly because, of course, we have federal buildings or installations that are around the world, but also, if I could ask a couple of questions, with a show of hands or standing up, how many of you in here work for an agency that somebody wears uniforms, or you procure uniforms for government employees? That's a pretty good bunch of you. How many of you buy food that is consumed by government employees? Or I guess even school lunch programs? It's a smaller group. And then the third question would be, how many of you manage facilities where there's some degree of irrigation taking place? You're thinking of lawns or flowers. Yeah, so that's a whole other bunch of you. So those of you who wear uniforms or you buy uniforms, think about, where do the raw materials for that clothing come from? And my guess is, I could be totally wrong, but my guess is that it's probably coming from different countries. It's being assembled in different countries, and maybe some part of it is done in the US, but it's really impacting global supply chains. And the food that is also purchased for government employees or through government programs is probably also not all grown in the United States. So an important thing about water, whether it's quantity or quality, is that one can certainly be very rigorous in how you prioritize what practices you do and where you invest your resources to manage that supply, but you've really got to look at the local water supply.
I'm glad you mentioned water quality as well, because I think that as managers interested in water, we sort of care about it not just on the front end and how much we're using and how efficiently we're using it, but there's a back end as well, wastewater, whether we're point source dischargers or we discharge to the local municipal treatment plant, or maybe we operate facilities with sufficient either impervious surface or a big land area where we're contributing to non-point source runoff. And incumbent on all of us as good environmental stewards, as well as clearly the spirit and the letter of the executive order, meeting those requirements with respect to water on the back end, wastewater quality and discharges. I think equally important, and I guess I would wonder if you guys could perhaps reflect for a minute on the types of challenges that are out there for managers of the type that are sitting here in the room.
Well, so a lot of my experience comes from agriculture. So I guess, again, I'd go back to anyone who's buying food or clothing that's coming from cotton or other agricultural materials. So the big wastewater issues are, what's happening to the runoff that comes from the land or from the livestock that's raised to produce that food, as well as then the entire supply chain until that food gets to you or gets to wherever it's being consumed. I think the big challenge is generally when there may be quite a distance between the person who's buying the food and where it's coming from, or the agricultural raw material, it can almost seem insurmountable of, well, how am I supposed to impact whether it's water use or even wastewater and discharge on some operation that I don't even have any control, let alone significant influence over. And that's where working within the supply chain and partnerships become really critical.
Yeah, I think the water quality issue is very challenging because of the complexity of the federal government. I'm never going to forget an example that I was made aware of as a graduate student. One of my colleagues was studying unexploded ordnance on different military installations or testing, proving grounds in the United States. And that's been a challenge just because of some of the types of contaminants that may be released into groundwaters unintentionally, including perchlorate and other types of examples. And so that being said, you also have the more traditional property management concerns with stormwater. And that links to some of the research that we've done in stormwater management, trying to identify incentives for large property owners or even small property owners to invest more in low impact development. And so the reason that this is so challenging is just because the incentives are not very clear. It's very difficult for local utilities to find the right types of incentives aside from just the basic cost or stormwater charge to encourage large property owners to invest in low impact development. And so while many of you are probably already aware of the types of low impact development techniques that your facilities might use or trying to identify ways of solving parking problems that don't involve building larger parking lots, more impervious surfaces, trying to capture more stormwater on site, the other things that you might be able to engage in are partnerships between yourself, the local utility, and the local community, just to build broader awareness around low impact development so that more people will be able to take advantage of non-financial incentives, meaning non-stormwater charge incentives. Now, the other thing that federal managers, especially those who are in EPA and are responsible for stormwater trading credits or just environmental markets in general, one of the challenges is the diversity in the type of stormwater trading markets that we have in the United States. Just like the diversity in nutrient trading markets, there are some states in the United States that at least have a functioning trading market, whereas there are other states that have the trading market on the books, but there's not really been very many robust trades. So there's diversity all over the map. And thinking of ways to engage the stakeholder community, whether we're talking about the agricultural community in terms of nutrients, or whether we're talking about large landowners or small households for stormwater management, think of ways to partner with your local governments to increase the awareness and incentives for installation of novel stormwater control techniques is one of the things that I'd be interested in hearing about from your end.
You know, and if I could add, so back in the late 80s, I was a park ranger in Hawaii, and I recall that, you know, we had to wear the Park Service uniforms, and the most common complaint was, these aren't very stylish uniforms, and it was sort of a awful feeling polyester. And so the whole textile manufacturing process is rife with all sorts of discharge issues and challenges. And I guess I would say maybe part of the challenge is going back to you guys and to the government and saying, wouldn't it be cool if government employees who are wearing uniforms are not only proud of wearing the uniform because of what it represents and says about who they are, but because of the message of if they're able to figure out, you know, work with the supplier and say there's got to be a solution for how we're dyeing textiles or how we're actually making the textile from the raw materials, and that it's really a fairly clean process. I mean, that would be sort of a really cool added sexiness to wearing the uniform.
If I could just add on to that, Beth, just for a moment. This just touches on another thing that I'm aware of. I know that for many federal government agencies, they're concerned about alternatives analysis for different types of chemical usage. And this is another example of how we need to take a systems approach. So we need to look at ways that other investments or other activities we're currently taking to address other problems may also solve this water problem. And that's an excellent example of how those type of non-traditional approaches to chemical evaluation for weapon systems or other missions may also contribute to the water impact solutions as well.
Look at the whole ag field. Everyone's talking about drones and precision agriculture, and so much of that came from defense. So yeah, there's absolutely a lot of synergistic solutions.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with the way that those solutions are identified in the federal government, but I'm sure if there are opportunities for water managers to identify those, that would definitely increase the effectiveness of the water management programs as well.
So when you guys think about zooming out to that systems perspective that you just mentioned, I'm wondering if that vantage point allows us to see gaps in what we might want to be doing as managers in institutions. I mean, clearly complying with legal requirements, your NIPD's Clean Water Act permit, that's pretty easy to figure out. Complying with the executive order is pretty easy to figure out. But if you put yourself in the shoes of an environmental manager in a federal agency, are there other things when you come out to the systems view? I know you mentioned the energy-water nexus.
Yeah.
You mentioned supply chain. Are there other things that perhaps aren't on the radar scope that should be?
Well, so I think one of the things that I did in my previous job was carbon footprinting, and also worked with someone who did water footprinting. And so just sort of using a life cycle analysis approach to take a systems view of something, whether it's the enterprise or the organization, so to speak, or whether it's a product that the government is making or that you're purchasing, and sort of scientifically and methodically identifying where those opportunity hotspots are, and having the science to say this is why we should target this area. And I don't know to what extent that is done, and it may well be done quite extensively throughout the government. So I'm not trying to imply by any means that that's not done. But I just know, so when I first got to my previous job, a large retailer had sent back into packaged good companies a packaging scorecard, and all these companies were doing carbon footprinting. And I had actually come from EPA, and I was saying, I'm sure that transportation is definitely going to be the big part of this carbon footprint of, say a beverage or a snack. And so my manager at the time said, well, go do the footprint, go look at the numbers, because she had already done some, she knew what the answer to that was. And it showed that no, transportation was not the big opportunity for that portfolio of packaged goods. It was more looking at agriculture, and it was more looking at packaging. So, and then once you've got that science to tell you what to do, it's much easier to go to your managers and say, this is why we need to budget for this, or this is why we need to partner with these guys to find a solution for this, and really pushing solutions through that way.
That certainly makes sense. Just a quick warning, if audience members do have questions, be sure to get them to one of our green T-shirted ushers so we have the opportunity to take them. So let's pivot off that last point and think about situations where we've been particularly successful in dealing with sustainability issues around water, things that either you've done in your career that you're particularly proud of, or examples that you're aware of, and maybe help us take the conversation a little deeper, not just pat ourselves on the back because we've done a great job, but understand what the drivers of success were in those cases, and what kind of barriers popped up, and how did you knock them down? So success stories, and what does it take to recreate them?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of success stories, the previous speaker, I don't remember the name, but he mentioned the behavioral aspect. And the state of California has just demonstrated that as we become aware of crises, we can make behavioral changes that are effective in reducing water consumption. Not to mention, just over the long term, our water consumption, just like our energy consumption, has gone down per capita dramatically. So there are a lot of successes around water consumption broadly. Now, I think that we can build on top of those because of the way that the United States federal government leases properties, in that they can have an impact that lasts far beyond the amount of time that the lease is current. And so the reason for that is because a lot of times the cost of water efficiencies are passed on to, or I should say lack of water efficiencies are passed on to the tenants. But because of the way that the federal government makes contracts, they're able to force some of these investments up front, and some of these investments will then make the general public more aware of other things that they could do either in their homes or in their businesses or on their properties to improve water efficiency. Not to mention when that lease ends and if it's chosen not to be renewed, that building still has those efficiencies that are now there embedded for the longer term. So I think we can build on some of the behavioral successes that we've had. Another opportunity is to develop a scoring mechanism that will allow these type of energy and water nexus challenges to be counted towards a 2% reduction target for water reduction. And as an example, one thing that will build off of what I mentioned earlier about partnerships with utility is looking at the impacts of cooling systems. And so most people are probably already aware that the evaporative cooling takes a lot more water, consumes more water than the non-evaporative cooling. But that in turn requires more energy for the non-evaporative cooling compared with the evaporative cooling. Now, combined with the system's evaluation of where you're situated locally, there may be water savings for using a non-evaporative cooling system that offset some of the increases in electricity needed for each BTU cooled. And that may also be possible to do if you're using electricity from a source that uses less water. And so there may be enough of an electricity efficiency across the facility more broadly, there may be enough of an energy efficiency reduction that looking at those type of trade-offs may be worthwhile. And so those two things I think are opportunities. Developing a scoring mechanism that allows these type of energy, water impacts or connections to be counted towards that 2%, and then building on some of the behaviors that the general public has been made aware of and some of the behavioral successes. Those are some things that I think would be interesting going forward.
And I think I can detect in your comments, Royce, that idea that this is not a one-size-fits-all, that many of these calculations are going to depend on local supplies of water, yes, temperature conditions that affect the efficiency of evaporative cooling. Yes. So is there a cautionary tale about how best to think about this in specific locations?
I wouldn't say cautionary tale. I would say that the science around water footprinting is not as advanced as the science around greenhouse gas footprinting. And so a lot of the efforts that will be made by the federal government will in fact be fundamental scientific contributions as well. And so I wouldn't necessarily say a cautionary tale more than that there's just exciting opportunities available for identifying ways to characterize water footprint, especially around smart buildings or smarter infrastructure that would make a practical contribution to practice and also a fundamental scientific contribution that could be built upon more broadly.
Mm-hmm, that makes sense.
You know, and I think paying attention to the nexus issues that you were talking about, you know, energy and water, maybe helps to prevent some of those unintended consequences that tend to happen when we're just focusing on one parameter or one medium. And so it's sort of that whole idea of even thinking of whether it's any sort of construction or innovation, thinking of all the issues up front rather than getting to the end and saying, oops, how do we retrofit to make this meet our goals? I also was going to mention a California program that I recently became aware of, is the turf replacement program, which I thought was really kind of cool. You know, I don't know all the ins and outs of how well it's working. I know some people who have used the program, and basically, you know, they were trying to incentivize, what is it? I think it's 50 million square feet of turf to be replaced with drought-tolerant landscaping. And so incentivizing homeowners to take out their water-loving lawns and replace it with native, more dry, you know, drought-resistant plants. And I guess they have an institutional one as well for some facilities in the San Joaquin Valley. But so definitely incentivizing those sorts of behavioral changes, I think, works. The other thing is a lot of food and beverage companies are developing sustainability, environmental, social, and economic sustainability programs for their agricultural supply chains. You're seeing some of that also in the fashion industry. And so, you know, maybe considering partnering with some of those companies so that you can really build out some of the successes. You know, especially if you're talking to some of the big food service companies, knowing that they're probably either developing those programs themselves or some of their suppliers are pushing those programs and encouraging them to take them on. You become another perfect partner to help scale some of these programs. So again, whether it's looking at water or other resources.
It seems like a recurring theme in this whole enterprise is sometimes the difficulty of convincing top management, the executive suite, or the presidentially appointed leaders of the wisdom of some of these investments, which may have upfront costs. I know in your career you've had to make that business case more than once for sustainability initiatives. I'm sure many of the people in this room are trying to make business cases to their leadership about investments in sustainability. So any tips or tricks on what it takes to make the case to the big boss?
Have the data. Have the data and have the data. Have all the numbers at your, don't get paralyzed by not having perfect data, but make sure you've got enough data to make the argument so that you can tell what you're going to accomplish, what it's going to take to accomplish it, and how much time. Stay away from all the passionate stuff because that only works with a few people. You've really got to bring the cold, hard facts. And sorry, one more thing. Mm-hmm. It is important also to talk about how that your actions will then impact your brand. And I don't know how many people in the government think of yourselves as having a brand, but you've got a brand. And you want people to trust you, and you want people to come to you for assistance and to come to you for collaboration. And so really thinking about, well, how are all these things impacting our brand is critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I would defer to Beth's answer on this question just because these come from her experiences at Pepsi, just dealing with that. The complexity of the decision context that they're facing is something I've recently become aware of through the alternatives analysis work that we're doing with the Health and Environmental Sciences Institute on trying to give guidance for making these type of decisions. And one of the things I was just unaware of was just how many things affect the brand positioning, how many things affect the functionality of the product that the organization is trying to produce, and so on. And that these type of what we might call sustainability goals, while they're important, they're a small part of the functionality of the product, or they're a small part of the brand positioning of the product. And so I think just bringing that data and just demonstrating the business case in light of the mission of the agency, I think this is a sound piece of advice that I didn't appreciate the complexity of until very recently, based on some of the work I was doing.
Yeah, I've heard that referred to as sort of mainstreaming sustainability and in some cases adaptation, decision making, that it's not something apart from the full set of criteria that drive all the decisions that organizations are making all the time. It just needs to have a seat at the table.
That's right.
Along with all the other considerations.
Part of it is also pointing out risk, risk to the organization if you don't do this. It's pointing out the resilience that would come from doing these activities. But the bulk of it is having the numbers and dollars and cents and, liters of water conserved or avoided.
We have about 8 minutes left. Let me grab some audience questions, and we can hear what's on folks' minds. We'll start with this one. For low-impact development and other water retention techniques, how have state and local laws become barriers or drivers to water adaptation?
Wow. If I could use Maryland and apply it to nutrients instead of LID, because I think here in DC, the local approach to LID has been more of a facilitator than a barrier. But in Maryland, where I live, in terms of nutrient trading, the local approach is, it's a mixed bag. So one of the things that limits the adoption of trading in Maryland is the fact that Maryland is requiring all major point sources to change their treatment techniques to reduce their emission of sediment and nutrients. And these advanced technologies, for example, advanced wastewater treatment is required. And so you have to do that before you can start looking at ways to start generating credits. The other thing that's challenging is that in Maryland, you can't use the USDA investments, the USDA Soil Conservation Service investments in runoff control or best management practices to generate credits. They would call that double counting against a federal or state investment.
Interesting.
And so looking at the differences in the programs, the types of sources that can trade between each other. For example, in Virginia, non-point sources and point sources can trade between each other for certain sizes of verified reductions, whereas in Maryland, it's not quite possible. Looking at the structure of these nutrient trading programs, there's a lot of diversity in the way they're executed. And this is what I was talking about earlier with regards to LID. It's very difficult to identify incentives that will protect at a baseline level the environment while encouraging further reductions in either nutrient or sediment runoff. And in the case of that questioner, LID. So I'm sorry I didn't directly answer the question. I would say here in DC, I think that there have been efforts that more promote the use of LID. I'm not quite sure they're legal in nature, so I don't know about laws promoting that, but I think that the adoption has been pretty good. I think there's a bigger challenge in terms of nutrients and sediment control.
Beth, do you want to weigh in on kind of how state and local, variations in state and local water policies end up affecting bigger institutions, maybe that operate nationally?
Well, of course, there's always the ease if there's sort of one set of standards. You know, if you're a company that's got manufacturing plants all around the US or all around the world, and so let alone the lack of alignment of one standard in this country, but then if you take it to other countries, and some countries maybe don't even have any regulation, there's sort of the whole question of, well, do we go to a, do you just have a corporate organizational threshold and say everything is going to come up to this? And if so, is that a European one? Is it an American one? You know, so there's certainly challenges, I guess not insurmountable. I think the companies that take a leadership role are going to try and definitely not be at the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that lowest common denominator is an important point, because here in DC you have to store at least 1 inch of stormwater. I believe that's the right number. I don't know what it is in Maryland. So we're not talking about there being zero. I think the question is pointing at how can we get even further beyond that, and I'm just not quite sure about that. That's something that's unclear to me.
Yeah, I've got an interesting question here about the kind of economics of water conservation, and the questioner explains that the low cost of water creates an idea that water conservation is not particularly important. So what's a tangible way to change the culture around water conservation? You know, if you're trying to build a business case, but you're really saving a trivial amount of money by reducing your water usage if water is particularly inexpensive, how is that possible to create that business case despite the low price of water?
Yeah, in Flint, it's not inexpensive anymore. In Baltimore, our rates are going up 30% this year, and then another, I forget what the rate increase is going to be next year, and so on. A lot of, and the common denominator between places like Baltimore and Flint is that you have formerly industrial cities with declining population base, and so the system was built for much larger rate payment that would be spread out across a broader number of population. And so your rates were lower, but now that we have infrastructure upgrades coming, the rates are going to go up in some of these cities that are characterized by declining populations, declining industrial base, but very large sunk cost in the infrastructure that needs to be replaced or rehabilitated. And so for a lot of those older cities, the rates may be inexpensive today, but they won't be very inexpensive going forward. We already see some of that with places that are subject to consent decrees on the wastewater side, where in order to avoid other types of enforcement, the consent decree is forcing utilities to, not forcing, but utilities are now under consent decrees trying to find ways to reduce or eliminate combined sewer overflows. And these require infrastructure upgrades that also require the stormwater and wastewater fees to go up. And so while it's cheap now, I think some of the cultural change is going to happen as water rates start to increase in some of these older cities more naturally. Now in places where the infrastructure is newer, then this is much more of a challenge. How do we get people to look at more than just the cost of the water that they save or consume in order to have a more cultural impetus for saving water? And I think there's just a lot of opportunity to try and identify what the right types of incentives are, what the right types of communication are. Because just like with LID, unless we're facing a crisis, it's just not clear what the right incentives or what the right cultural push is, given the price of water and the perception of who provides water and who's responsible for it here.
So do you think the crisis, just to pick on the example we talked about earlier in California, the drought clearly changed the political landscape and made certain policy measures feasible?
I think so, but
in a moment of crisis, we were able to do.
I think so, but in that case, it was temporary, I think. And so people, I think even though a lot of those changes, people who have done them and see that they can live with those, they'll keep doing them. I think some people may have viewed those more than we like, viewed them as temporary, and they may revert to prior behaviors. So we just want to be careful about that.
Okay. We have about a minute left. I guess I'd like to offer the floor to both of you to tell us anything that we forgot to ask you that this group should hear about. Words of wisdom, words of encouragement. Last thoughts.
In terms of resilience, and I'll only take about 20 seconds with this, one of the things that I know the water infrastructure industry needs is the ability to have mutual assistance partnerships across state lines, just increasing the resilience and the sustainability in the event that increases in natural disaster occurrence go up. And so I just like to plant that seed. I don't know where that would go for water managers in the federal level, but how do we increase the ability to get mutual aid across state lines is something that might be interesting.
And perhaps across departmental lines.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Within the federal government. Beth?
I think I'd reiterate things that I've already said. Don't be afraid of partnerships with private industry. Embrace them. Make sure you're leading with the science, but don't be paralyzed by not having perfect science. Don't underestimate your ability to be a trend setter, and whether it's thinking about how the clothing is made and it being sort of sustainable government fashion, or whether it's if you're running a facility and you're doing landscaping in front of it, perhaps you've done a water footprint and the landscaping, I'd be kind of surprised, but suppose the landscaping weren't the major thing. But it's your window to the public, and so it's your opportunity to teach, like alongside the butterfly garden and in front of the Museum of Natural History, I was noticing yesterday the different plants and stuff and the education there, and it's an opportunity that you guys have and should continue to seize.
Great. Well, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panel. I hope you found the remarks helpful, and I think we're done.